And I told my mom that, I said, you know what? When I grow up, I'm never going to work in hotels because you got to work on weekends. Can you imagine? Weekends is where you're totally off. I remember looking at the eggs, right? Sort of like spilling to the front and then back. And then it was spilling to the front again. And then I was like, am I drunk or drowsy? This, right? Was that working late in the hotel back then was something like a must, right? Where if you sort of go back home early, you're perceived as you're not working. Hi, my name is Adrian, and welcome to the Vision Impossible podcast, where we talk about everything relating to the hospitality industry. And so I kind of decided to start a podcast so that I can share about how it all began in the industry.
Adrian, tell us, how did you get into the hospitality industry?
Well, it's unbelievable, right? When you talk about how I got in the industry, I have to bring you back when I was very, very young. I think I was about 7 or 8 years old, where my mom used to sort of bring us to dine in restaurants, right? And obviously we come from a very poor family, and she would be able to sort of bring us into hotels only once a year. So she'll probably save up, and she worked very hard, right, to save on a bonus, and then once a year she'll bring us, and then we'll probably we used to dine in this place called Sky Room, I think, and it's one of these hotels called Hotel Malaysia or something like that. And I remember, right, because when I was eating in a restaurant, I really enjoyed myself. That's the time where you kind of like overeat because you see like there's so much food, right? You really enjoy it. And I remember overeating. But besides that, right, I used to sit down and I remember that this used to play in my head. I remember it was a weekend. I kind of thought to myself and looked around at the people working there. And I said, wow, they have to work on weekends, right? That's not really fun. And I told my mom that, I said, you know what? When I grow up, I'm never going to work in hotels because you got to work on weekends. Like, can you imagine? Weekends is where you're totally off. And instead of being off, you have to work. So I told my mom, I'm not going to work in hotels. But lo and behold, I'm in the hotel industry. So the idea is that you never say never, because once you say never, it really happens to you. So that's my first exposure in the hotel industry. So from there, I was obviously a person that was not very good in my studies. And when I wanted to further my education, they told me this, that if you're not very good at your studies, there's one program that is really suitable for you, and that is to study hotels. I thought, oh, okay. And they said, yeah, hotels very easy. This is the easiest course available. So logically, I signed up to study hospitality. And I remember when I signed up for this hospitality course, right? And it was actually in this college called KNU. My hair was obviously dyed. I was a DJ prior to actually studying, right? And it was hair, earrings everywhere. And I remember going for the open day and signing up for the course. And they told me something totally different. They said, Adrian, when you study hospitality, you obviously can't dye your hair. Because, back then in school, we kind of like really look forward to dyeing our hairs and wearing earrings, right? Because there was like freedom for us. And then suddenly I have to go back to, unable to dye my hair, got to remove all my earrings. That was a bit of a disappointment. And my lecturer that back then said, you got to wear uniform every day. You got to comb your hair nicely. You got to shave. You got to do so many things. I'm like, oh my goodness, here we go again, school again, right? But anyway, they told me it's easy. So I thought, okay, easy, then I just sign up for the course. So that's how I actually enrolled in KDU. And I did a short, because when I signed up, it was like a crash course because the initial term had started and I probably have 3 months to catch up. So it was a 3 months program for our first term. So I had to really study hard. And my goodness, there's so many things to learn in a hotel, from accounting to language to beverage studies to, it was like, wow. And I remember this thing playing in my head, people who said, oh, hotels are very easy, it's very, very simple. I was thinking to myself, I don't think so. It was easy. It's actually very difficult. The only thing I enjoyed studying hotels is obviously the beverage studies where we learn about alcohol, right? So we could sample wine, we could sort of taste them a bit. Of course, we could drink and spit it out. But I enjoyed that part. Other than that, I think it was okay. But I was very lucky to actually have very good lecturers. And one of my lecturer that I still keep in touch with is Susie Koo. She's an amazing principal. And she's a very inspiring lady, right? Very tough, very strong lady. And I think she was one of those that sort of inspired me to do a lot of what I'm doing today. The two particular lecturers also, one which is Mr. Sampson. Sampson was one of our lecturers. Mr. Victor Suse, who's actually one of our service lecturer, who taught us a lot about how to deliver excellent service. Right? And he's one guy who's really on time. You know, Malaysians are always not on time. He's really on time. It's 8 o'clock. He's there at 7:30, dressed up well, waiting for everyone to come in. So he was our service lecturer. And then we had Cindy, who's our chef, taught us about cooking. And I still remember we had this person by the name of Mr. Chan. Mr. Chan was our pastry chef who taught us all about how to cook up the best cakes and pastries. So a lot of these lectures inspired me on what I wanted to do later on in life. So anyway, when I went on the program, luckily I passed because I remember my lecturer telling me this, right? If you fail, you have to resit. I think there's a certain number of subjects that you can't fail. If you fail, you have to retake the whole course. And obviously, when you come from a poor family, you can't retake the whole course because it costs a lot of money. So I had no choice but to study. And this was interesting because I remember my mom telling me this, right? Oh, I can't believe you're studying, Because back then, right, getting you to read a book was like pulling teeth out from you. And today you're like reading. So she was really impressed. And that's how I passed my exams and eventually I sort of moved. I think there's a part where we finish our theory and then there's an internship program.
So could you walk us through your internship? Where did you do your internship?
My internship program was at this hotel called Shangri-La. And I was very lucky to get into the hotel. And I remember my first few months of internship was actually at the hot kitchen. And during my training time, I had my sous chef. His name is Chef Teo. Teo. And he stationed me, and I remember this, right? He stationed me at the egg station. And if some of you know, if you remember this day called 25th December, it was Christmas. And on Christmas morning, I was manning the egg station. And I remember when I was doing an omelette, I remember looking at the eggs, right? Sort of like spilling to the front and then back. And then it was spilling to the front again. And then I was like, am I drunk or drowsy? Because I was confused for a moment, only to realize later that the whole building was shaking. And that was actually how I experienced my first emergency and disaster. Emergency, which was that time called tsunami. And everyone panicked, I dropped everything. Of course, I switched off the stove when it will be up in flames. And I saw everyone panicking and running down the hotel, assembling in the loft. That was really scary for me because it was my first month doing internship and I was faced with something like that. It really caught me off guard. But that taught me a lot about why is it important to actually prepare for emergency situations? Because you then know what to do. And if you don't practice, right, you tend to, when something happens like that, you're just like totally lost. So that's my first experience in Shangri-La, where of course, I went through other departments, right, being chef, being a waiter, and then I went on to big front office and so on and so forth. But I was also very lucky to actually have a chance to work here in the sales department, where I was kind of exposed to how the sales work in a hotel. Because that's something that I never learned in school. Because in school, we learn typically about check-in, checking out of customers, cleaning rooms, about costings, about language, but we've never covered anything about sales. So I was fortunate enough to be exposed and I had the chance to go out for sales call And I remember when we were visiting clients, I was like, oh, that's how it works, right? I never knew that you have a sales team in a hotel. And that sales team's job is to actually visit clients, corporate clients, governments, to sort of get business in for the hotel. I thought, like, if you open a hotel, people just book and just come and dine. I never knew you need a sales team to do that. So I was fortunate enough to be exposed to this. And I kind of really liked how it worked. I kind of felt like, wow, this is nice, right? You get to talk. Obviously, the plus point is that back then, handphones were still very new. And I remember, when you work in a hotel, you cannot use handphone. But if you work in a sales team, you get to use the handphone. So I was thinking to myself, wow, how nice would it be if I get to actually use the handphone, right? Of course, it's not a big deal now, but back then to me it was a big deal. And I remember that, oh, you could suit up, you could dress up well. And I was like, wow, this is really so nice. So I ended my internship with the sales department, and I learned a lot over there. So basically, I think Shangri-La provided me with the foundation of a lot of things: service, systems, structure. It gave me a lot of ideas, and it helped me a lot when I was pursuing my career later on. So how was your career after your internship? Where did you start off with? I was fortunate enough to be offered a job after my internship. And I remember this lady I mean, her name was Angeline Pascal, and she offered me a job. And she said, look, we want to offer you a job, and I know you're going back to school. After 6 months, once you finish, would you like to come back and join us as a salesperson? I said, wow, of course, right? I would. I mean, I love that, right? So I started in the sales department as a sales exec, and I was so happy being offered that job. But there was something that was a bit short, to be honest, where, back then, right, a lot of things were still very manual. And I remember that, there's a typical cubicle, and in the center, there's a computer. And I remember when I started the job, I thought I'll get a computer by myself. But I was actually asked to share a computer with my buddy, right? Her name is Adrian. And we had to like share computers. Obviously, today you will not understand how is it possible to share computers. But back then, during my time, we had to share our computers. And my boss sort of felt that, since you're going out for sales calls every day, you don't need to use you don't really need to use the computer. So therefore, you all share computers. So the computer's in the center and you're going to share computers. That was something odd that I really felt. I was like, how would you be productive if you're going to share something, right? To me, well, it didn't make sense, but perhaps back then the idea is that, because you're going to spend most of the time out, so then you're not going to spend so much time in the office. So, having one laptop makes sense. But maybe some of you might know this, right? Salespeople have to do reports. And sometimes we really had to stay back really, really late to do reports. Because when I do my report, my buddy cannot do a report. So she got to go home. And it's mine. I can use it up to maybe 8, 9 o'clock at night and then wrap up my report. And the next day, she'll stay back, I'll go back early. So that was something that I didn't know, when I was doing my internship. I didn't take note of it. But that was something odd that I experienced. Of course, today, such a thing won't happen. It happens that soon.
Was Shangri-La just your first job, or did you move on to other positions and other departments?
Shangri-La was my first job. And I continued my role in sales. But there's something that nobody told me about working in the hotel industry, which I thought it's something I learned when I started this, right? Was that working late in the hotel back then was something like a must, right? Where if you sort of go back home early, you're perceived as you're not working. But if you go back home late, you're perceived as extremely hardworking. I couldn't understand that, because what if you're able to execute things fast and you didn't need so much time to complete something? Would it make sense to go back home versus, put it on a show? And I found that later on, hotels, well, not all, but there's some hotels who emphasize so much about this kind of showmanship, right? Where you have to be in the office and you got to be around. Even though you finish your work, you still got to be there. and wait for your boss to go back. Then only you go back, right? That just totally didn't make sense to me. But that was the typical culture back then. And so that's something that I no one told me about, right? And I had to learn through the industry. Number two is that, well, being in sales, it sort of felt that smoking and drinking was sort of like a ticket to moving into an inner circle, to a circle of influential people, or it was it clients or people in the hotel. So like a ticket to the cool team. I found that a bit odd. When I did smoke, and I obviously didn't drink that much like that, but I felt it was like something you had to do. You're pressured to do it if you want to be part of the most successful, influential team. And that sort of explained why you notice a lot of hoteliers, right? After 20 to 30 years of working, they tend to fall sick because a lot of them lack sleep, drink heavily, smoke heavily, don't look after their health, and eventually at 20, 30, everything comes knocking on the door. All types of sickness does and knocks on the door. So, but that's something that no one told me about. Another thing is that, especially when you work in, this is interesting, like this point is interesting. When you work in a brand, an international brand, you sort of have to you have to be in the right camp. Right? What he means by being in the right camp is that, in HQ, your bosses kind of follow this guy in HQ, and this is the rising star, and you're going to follow this group because once this one person is promoted from HQ, the entire line of people just gets promoted, right? So it was kind of different of what I learned in school, because in schools, we were taught that you had to do well, you had to perform well, you had to be fast, you had to come up with new ideas, you had to show up, right? Because back then, a lot of people just took MC and just didn't turn up. But when I started working, I realized that, oh, you have to do this, right? And then I think that's why today a lot of hoteliers, right, they spend so much time trying to find the right camp, trying to support the right team, so that in hopes that when this group of people are promoted, they are also promoted, which I think totally doesn't make sense, right? So I think these are some things that I've learned that sort of no one has told me about. Yeah. So anyway, I hope some of these stories I share is interesting. And if you really like what you hear, what you're listening to, I hope you like and subscribe. And we'll push out as much content as we can. Anyway, this is the first episode, so we'll see what happens. Thank you.